Researchers find long-lost ship on bottom of the ocean. They turn pale when seeing what's inside. The morning sun barely peeked over the horizon when Sarah stretched in her chair, fighting off another yawn. She'd been staring at the sonar screen for so long her eyes felt dry and scratchy. The gentle hum of the research vessel Endurance's engines had become white noise after 3 months at sea, but today something felt different. Maybe it was the unusually calm waters, or maybe it was just her gut feeling, but Sarah couldn't shake the sense that this wasn't going to be an ordinary day. Before we can continue, if you love your family, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. Coffee. Tom, one of the junior researchers, appeared beside her with 2 steaming cups. Sarah grabbed one gratefully, letting the warmth seep into her cold fingers. The control room was always kept cool to protect the equipment, and after 12-hour shifts, the chill had a way of settling into your bones. Thanks. Any word from Captain Ross about how much longer we'll stay in this grid? Sarah asked, taking a careful sip. They'd been searching this particular section of the North Atlantic for weeks, following historical records and complex mathematical models that suggested the Marigold, a 19th-century trading vessel, might have sunk somewhere in these waters. Tom shrugged, pulling up a chair next to her. Last I heard, we've got another 2 days before we need to move on. Budget's getting tight. He didn't need to say more. Everyone knew that finding lost ships was expensive work, and their financial backers were getting antsy about the lack of results. Sarah nodded and turned back to her screen, adjusting some settings. The Marigold had become something of an obsession for her over the past year. She'd spent countless hours researching its disappearance, reading old ship's logs and weather reports from the period. The ship had vanished without a trace during what should have been a routine voyage to Europe, taking with it a cargo hold full of mysteries and a crew whose families never got closure. The morning crawled by slowly. Sarah watched the sonar data scroll past, showing nothing but the usual seafloor topology. She'd gotten good at identifying rocks, slopes, and the occasional school of fish. Tom had dozed off in his chair, his empty coffee cup threatening to slip from his fingers. Then she saw it. Just a slight irregularity in the sonar return, something that didn't quite match the natural patterns she was used to. Sarah sat up straighter, her heart beating faster as she fine-tuned the equipment. The shape became clearer. Straight lines where there should be random patterns, right angles that nature rarely created. "Tom," she said quietly, then louder when he didn't stir. "Tom, wake up." He jerked awake, nearly dropping his cup.
What?
"What is it? Look at this." Sarah pointed to her screen, her hand shaking slightly. "Tell me I'm not seeing things." Tom leaned in, sleep forgotten. His eyes widened as he took in the image. That's definitely man-made. Hold on, let me pull up the historical specs." He rushed to his own station, fingers flying over the keyboard as he brought up the architectural plans they had for the Marigold. Sarah kept adjusting the sonar, trying to get the clearest possible image. More crew members began filtering into the control room, drawn by the growing excitement. Someone called for Captain Ross, and soon the room was packed with people speaking in hushed, excited voices. The captain arrived wearing a serious expression that broke into a smile as he saw the sonar data. "Well done, Sarah," he said, squeezing her shoulder. "Let's get a better look at what we found." Launch the ROV. The next hour was a blur of activity. The remote-operated vehicle was prepared and launched, its powerful lights cutting through the darkness as it descended toward the mysterious shape on the seafloor. The entire crew gathered around the monitors, watching the live feed with bated breath. Sarah found herself holding hands with Tom, both of them squeezing tight as the first clear images came through. The ROV's lights revealed a ship's hull, largely intact despite centuries underwater. The wood was dark with age, but preserved by the cold depths. As the camera moved along the structure, Sarah could make out details that matched the Marigold's specifications perfectly. The unique curve of the bow, the spacing of the gun ports, even the distinctive figurehead, though it was now covered in coral. "It's her," Dr. Chun, their marine archaeologist, confirmed what everyone was already thinking. The dimensions matched perfectly. "We've found the Marigold." The control room erupted in cheers, but Sarah barely heard them. She was transfixed by the images on the screen, watching as the ROV continued its careful examination of the wreck. The ship sat upright on the seafloor, which was unusual enough to make her wonder. Most shipwrecks ended up on their sides, but the Marigold looked almost like it had been deliberately placed there. The ROV's cameras revealed more oddities as they continued their survey. The cargo hold doors appeared to be sealed, not blown open by the pressure or decay as they usually were in shipwrecks this old. Strange markings were visible on the wood, complex symbols that didn't match any shipping marks or known nautical designs of the period. "Captain," Sarah called out, pointing to one of the symbols. "What do you make of that?" Captain Ross frowned, leaning closer to the screen. "I've never seen anything like it, Dr. Chen." The archaeologist shook his head slowly. "They're not any kind of shipping marks I'm familiar with. They almost look like..." He hesitated, then shook his head again. "Never mind. We need better images. Can we get the ROV closer?" The ROV pilot carefully maneuvered the vehicle nearer to the hull, its lights illuminating more of the strange markings. They were carved deep into the wood, preserved by the same conditions that had kept the ship intact. Some seemed to form patterns, while others appeared random, but all of them gave Sarah an uneasy feeling she couldn't explain. "Look at how they're arranged," Tom pointed out. "They form complete circles around the cargo hold entrances, almost like they're meant to keep something in or out." "Let's stick to facts," Captain Ross said firmly, but Sarah noticed he was gripping the back of her chair tightly. "We need to document everything thoroughly before we make any assumptions. Sarah, start compiling all the sonar data. Tom, I want every second of this ROV footage backed up. Dr. Chen, prepare your preliminary report. We'll need it for the recovery planning." The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. Sarah's fingers flew over her keyboard as she organized the data, but her eyes kept straying to the video feeds. The ROV was making a complete circuit of the ship now, recording every detail. The more she saw, the more questions she had. The ship's condition was remarkable, showing far less decay than it should have after centuries underwater. The wood seemed almost pristine in places, and there was less marine growth than expected. Even the metal fittings showed minimal corrosion. It was as if the Marigold existed in its own bubble of time, separate from the normal processes of decay. As the day wore on, the initial excitement gave way to focused professional activity, but there was an undercurrent of tension that Sarah couldn't ignore. She noticed how Dr. Chen kept rewinding certain portions of the footage, studying the strange symbols with an increasingly troubled expression. Captain Ross made several satellite calls from his private cabin, speaking in low tones to people she assumed were their financial backers. By evening, preliminary plans were being made for a closer investigation. The ship's location was recorded with multiple redundancies, and a security watch was arranged to monitor the site continuously. Nobody said it out loud, but Sarah knew they were all thinking the same thing. They couldn't risk losing the Marigold again. As her shift finally ended, Sarah took one last look at the sonar image still displayed on her screen. The ship's outline was clear and sharp, almost too perfect. Tom appeared beside her, looking as exhausted as she felt. "Crazy day, huh?" he said, attempting a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Sarah nodded, unable to look away from the image. "Tom, does something about this feel off to you?" He was quiet for a moment, then said, "You mean besides a centuries-old ship looking like it was sealed up yesterday? Besides those weird symbols that our expert archaeologist won't talk about? Besides the whole thing sitting perfectly upright like it was placed there?" "Yeah," Sarah said softly. "Besides all that." Tom didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You know what it reminds me of? Those old stories my grandmother used to tell about things that were buried for a reason. Things that were meant to stay lost." Sarah finally turned away from the screen, meeting his eyes. "Well," she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt, "let's hope those were just stories." But as they left the control room, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they'd found more than just a missing ship. The Marigold had been lost for centuries, and as she thought about those strange symbols carved into its hull, A small voice in the back of her mind whispered that maybe it should have stayed that way. The next morning brought gray skies and a light drizzle that matched the crew's tense mood. Captain Ross had called an early meeting in the ship's main conference room, where coffee cups outnumbered people 2 to 1. The excitement of discovery had given way to something heavier, the weight of responsibility and growing unease about what lay below. Dr. Evelyn Grant arrived last, her arms full of old leather-bound books and loose papers. She'd spent most of the night in her cabin, diving into historical records and old shipping documents. Dark circles under her eyes suggested she hadn't slept much, if at all. "Right," Captain Ross began, his voice cutting through the quiet murmur of conversation. "We've got a lot to cover, and not much time. Dr. Grant, why don't you start us off?" Evelyn stood, spreading her materials across the table. "The Marigold's last known cargo manifest is incomplete," she said, holding up a yellowed piece of paper. "But what we do know is troubling. The ship was chartered by a private collector, a man named Edmund Blake. He'd spent several years traveling through Asia, particularly regions that were considered remote even by 19th century standards." She paused, shuffling through her papers. Blake's personal journals mention collecting artifacts from what he called forgotten temples and places that time tried to erase. Most of his writings were dismissed as the ramblings of an eccentric rich man, but she hesitated, glancing at the captain. "Go on," Ross encouraged, though his expression suggested he already knew what was coming. "The symbols we found on the hull? They match fragments of text from Blake's journal. Try to shake off the growing feeling that they were being watched." "There's the gun port," Leah said, pointing to a rectangular opening. According to their plans, it would give them the most direct route to the cargo hold. Marcus went first, shining his light into the opening. The beam caught swirling particles of sediment, creating dancing patterns in the water. The gun port was bigger than expected, easily large enough for them to swim through while wearing their gear. "Beginning entry," he reported, pushing forward into the ship. The water felt even thicker here, almost resistant to their passage. Leah followed close behind, her light providing additional illumination. Inside, the ship was a maze of preserved timbers and empty spaces where wood had finally given into time and pressure. Their lights created shifting shadows that played tricks on their eyes, making the space seem larger and smaller at the same time. "First checkpoint reached," Leah reported, though her voice sounded strained. Moving toward the main hold, they swam through what had once been the gun deck, past empty weapon mounts and scattered debris. Everything was covered in a fine layer of sediment that swirled up at their passing, temporarily blinding them until it settled again. "Keep getting these power fluctuations," Tom muttered over the comms. "Cameras are having trouble adjusting." "Copy that," Marcus replied, trying to sound calmer than he felt. "We've got good visibility with our lights, though." Moving to the next level, they found the hatch leading down to the cargo deck exactly where it should have been, though the wood looked too new, too clean. The symbols carved around its frame were more elaborate than the ones outside, forming complex patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. "I don't like this," Leah muttered, more to herself than anyone else. Her light beam caught something moving in the corner of her vision, but when she turned to look, there was nothing there but settling sediment. Marcus reached for the hatch, then hesitated. "Dr. Grant, are you seeing these symbols? They're different from the ones in your books." There was a long pause before Dr. Grant's voice came through, distorted by static. "Can you scribe them?" The feed breaking up. The communications were deteriorating, the voices from the surface becoming harder to understand. Marcus pulled out a small camera and began recording the symbols around the hatch, trying to ignore how the patterns seemed to writhe under his light. "Temperatures dropping," Leah reported, checking her instruments. "Down 3 degrees since we entered." That wasn't normal. Water temperature at this depth should remain constant. Marcus felt the cold too, seeping through his heated diving suit in a way that seemed to reach past his skin and into his bones. The hatch opened with surprising ease, swinging soundlessly on hinges that should have been frozen with rust. Beyond it, the cargo deck waited in absolute darkness, their lights barely penetrating the gloom. The water here was completely still, unnaturally so, as if it had been waiting undisturbed for centuries. Beginning descent to cargo deck, Marcus announced, though the static in his ears made him unsure if anyone could still hear him. He moved through the hatch, Leah close behind. The cargo deck was vast, larger than it should have been given the ship's external dimensions. Their lights revealed row after row of crates and barrels, all secured as if the ship had just been loaded. No sign of the chaos that usually accompanied a sinking. "This is impossible," Leah whispered. "Everything's still tied down, still in place." She was right. The cargo was meticulously arranged, secured with ropes that showed no signs of decay. Each crate bore more of those strange symbols, these ones seeming to absorb their light rather than reflect it. Marcus swam closer to one of the crates, his camera recording. The symbols here were different again, more complex and somehow more urgent. He felt a strange reluctance to look at them directly, as if they might make more sense than he wanted them to. "Do you hear that?" Leah asked suddenly, her voice tight with tension. Marcus started to say no, then stopped. There was something just at the edge of hearing. Not quite a sound, more like the memory of one. It reminded him of whispering, or maybe singing, in a language he'd never heard before. "Probably just the ship settling," he said, not believing it even as he spoke. The Marigold had done all its settling centuries ago. Their lights caught movement again, shadows that couldn't exist in the still water. The cold was getting worse, and Marcus noticed his hands were shaking slightly. Every instinct he had, honed by years of diving in dangerous conditions, was screaming at him to get out. "We should head back," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We've got enough initial footage for." He trailed off as his light beam found something that made his blood run even colder. One of the crates had shifted slightly, its securing ropes loose. The symbols carved into its surface were different from all the others, more intricate, more urgent, and somehow alive with a dark energy that made his eyes hurt to look at them. "Leah," he called softly, "are you seeing this?" But Leah was staring at something else, her light beam fixed on a point in the darkness beyond the crates. Marcus turned to look, and for a moment, he thought he saw something move in the shadows, something that shouldn't have been able to move in water this still. The whispers grew louder, though they still weren't quite sounds. The darkness between the crates seemed to deepen, to reach out toward them. Their lights dimmed, though their gauges showed full power. "We need to leave," Leah said, her voice shaking. "Now." Marcus didn't argue. They turned back toward the hatch, trying not to move too quickly, trying not to look like they were fleeing. But they both knew that's exactly what they were doing, and they both knew why. The cargo hold of the Marigold wasn't just a preserved piece of history. It was something else, something wrong, and they had disturbed its rest. Just as they turned to leave, Marcus's light caught something that made him freeze. A thin crack had appeared in the shifted crate, barely visible, but definitely there. Dark water seeped out, somehow darker than the surrounding ocean, moving like oil through the cold depths. "Marcus," Leah's voice wavered. "We should really go." But Marcus couldn't move. The crack was widening, not from pressure or decay, but as if something inside was pushing out. The whispers in his head grew louder, almost forming words now. His hand reached out toward the crate, fingers trembling. "Don't touch it." Leah grabbed his arm, but it was too late. His gloved fingers brushed the wood, and the crack split wider with a sound that shouldn't have been possible underwater. A deep, resonant crack that they felt in their bones. The lid lifted, moving with terrible slowness. The dark water pouring out seemed to eat their light, creating patches of absolute darkness that their beams couldn't penetrate. Inside the crate, something gleamed. "Control, are you receiving?" Leah called into her radio, getting only static in response. "Control? Sarah? Anyone?" Marcus pulled out his camera with shaking hands. The statues inside the crate were small, maybe 8 inches tall, arranged in a perfect circle. They seemed to be carved from some black stone that absorbed light completely, except for their eyes, which gleamed with a deep, crimson color that had no business existing this far underwater. "This is impossible," Leah whispered, moving closer despite herself. Paint can't survive at these depths, not for centuries. And those eyes. The eyes seemed to follow their movements. Each statue was unique, depicting humanoid figures and poses that seemed wrong somehow, anatomically incorrect in ways that were subtle but deeply unsettling. Their faces wore expressions that shouldn't have been possible to capture in stone. Marcus's camera whirred, documenting everything, though something told him the footage would never come out right. The statues seemed to shift when viewed through the lens, their positions changing slightly between blinks. "There's something else," he said, his voice hoarse. Inside the ring of statues lay a collection of scrolls, sealed with strange wax that hadn't dissolved in the water. The wax bore more symbols, these ones seeming to writhe and move under their direct gaze. Leah reached for one of the scrolls, her scientific training momentarily overriding her fear. The moment her fingers touched the wax, a jolt of something, not quite electricity, but similar, shot through her suit. She jerked back with a gasp. "You okay?" Marcus grabbed her arm, steadying her. "Yeah, just static shock, maybe?" They both knew that was impossible at this depth, surrounded by seawater, but neither wanted to consider the alternatives. The scroll had moved though, rolling slightly to reveal more beneath it. These were covered in script neither of them recognized, letters that seemed to squirm on the parchment surface. Marcus forced himself to keep filming, though his hands were shaking so badly now that the footage would probably be useless. A noise from above made them both look up. Something was moving on the deck above them, something heavy. The sound of footsteps shouldn't have carried through water, but they heard them clearly, slow, deliberate steps moving across the gun deck they'd just left. "That's not possible," Leah whispered. "There's nobody else down here." The steps grew closer to the hatch. Dark shapes moved in the water above, like shadows cast by something they couldn't see. The whispers in their heads grew louder, more insistent, almost forming words in a language that human tongues were never meant to speak. Marcus's light flickered and died. He banged it against his palm, but nothing happened. Leah's beam was growing dimmer too, the darkness seeming to press in around them like a physical force. "The statues," she said suddenly. "Look at the statues." The crimson eyes were glowing brighter now, providing their own illumination. The light they cast was wrong somehow, revealing things that shouldn't have been there, shadows that moved against the current, shapes that existed just at the edge of vision. "Dr. Grant." Marcus tried the radio again, his voice shaking. "Please tell me you're getting some of this." Static was his only answer, but within it, he thought he could hear voices, not from the ship above, but older voices, speaking words that made his head hurt. One of the scrolls had completely unrolled now, though neither of them had touched it. The script on it was moving, flowing across the surface like living things. As they watched, the symbols began to arrange themselves into patterns that were almost familiar, almost readable. "Don't look at it," Leah said suddenly, grabbing Marcus's arm. "Don't, there's something wrong with how it moves." She was right. The longer you looked at the writing, the more it seemed to make sense, and the more it made sense, the more you felt your mind trying to reject what it was understanding. Marcus tore his gaze away, feeling nauseated. The footsteps above had stopped, now directly over the hatch. Water was moving down through the opening, but not in any natural way. It spiraled down like a slow-motion whirlpool, darker than the surrounding ocean. "We need to leave," Marcus said, finally giving in to the terror that had been building since they entered the ship. "Right now." But as they turned to swim back to the hatch, their lights caught something that made them both stop cold. The other crates were changing. The symbols carved into their surfaces were glowing with the same crimson light as the statues' eyes, and thin cracks were appearing in their walls. Dark water was seeping out of every crack, every seam. The whispers were coming from inside the crates now, growing louder, more demanding. Their lights caught glimpses of other things inside, shapes that couldn't exist, objects that hurt to look at. "Move!" Leah screamed, grabbing Marcus's arm. They swam for the hatch, no longer caring about being careful or preserving evidence. The water seemed to fight against them, trying to hold them back. Marcus risked a glance over his shoulder and immediately wished he hadn't. The statues were no longer in their perfect circle. Each one had turned to face the fleeing divers, their crimson eyes blazing in the darkness. The scrolls were completely unrolled now, their script flowing off the parchment and into the water like living ink. The whispers had become a chorus, speaking words that resonated in their bones and made their vision blur. They reached the hatch just as Leah's light finally died. In the crimson glow from below, they could see something moving down there among the crates, something large, something that blocked out even the red light as it moved. Neither of them looked back again as they swam through the hatch, sealing it behind them. But they both knew that what they'd found in the cargo hold of the Marigold wasn't just artifacts or treasures. They'd found something that had been deliberately hidden, sealed away in the depths where it should have remained undisturbed. And now, as they fled toward the surface, they couldn't shake the feeling that it was waking up. Back on the Endurance, chaos erupted in the control room. The main lights flickered and died, leaving only the dim glow of emergency backup systems. Static filled every communication channel, punctuated by bursts of sound that might have been voices, but weren't quite human. "We've lost visual." Sarah's fingers flew across her keyboard, trying to restore the camera feeds. "Marcus? Leah? Do you copy?" Tom stood behind her, watching the equipment readings spike and fall in impossible patterns. "This isn't normal interference," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "These patterns, they're almost like..." "Like what?" Dr. Grant appeared beside him, her face pale in the glow of the monitors. "Like something's responding," he finished quietly. "Like something's talking back." The temperature in the control room dropped suddenly, their breath visible in the air. Dr. Grant pulled her books closer, flipping pages with trembling fingers. "The symbols," she said, her voice tight with fear. "I was wrong about them. They're not just warnings. They're containment seals." Captain Ross strode into the room, his usual calm demeanor showing cracks. "What do you mean, containment seals?" "Look at this." She spread out several pages covered in similar symbols. These markings appear in multiple cultures, always associated with binding rituals. They're meant to keep things trapped, contained. And we just broke them. A burst of static made everyone jump. Through the white noise, they could hear fragments of Marcus's voice. "Moving can't. Eyes everywhere." "Marcus." Sarah leaned into her microphone. "Marcus, what's happening down there?" Leah's voice cut through next, clearer but filled with panic. "Following us, the statues, wrong, all wrong." The ship's power fluctuated again, screens flickering between static and darkness. In those brief moments of blackness, everyone in the control room could have sworn they saw shapes moving in the shadows, glimpses of eyes that gleamed with a familiar crimson light. "Emergency ascent protocol," Captain Ross barked into his radio. "Get them up now." But the diving team was already reporting problems. The winch systems were malfunctioning, and the backup hydraulics were behaving erratically. It was as if something was interfering with every attempt to retrieve the divers. Dr. Grant's hands shook as she pulled out another book, this one bound in weathered leather. "Edmund Blake's final journal," she explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "Listen to this. The artifacts resist removal. They want to stay together, to remain sealed in their watery tomb. When separated, they call to each other, and their call drives men mad." The lights flickered again, and in that moment of darkness, everyone heard it, a sound like distant singing, in voices that couldn't have been human. When the lights returned, frost had formed on the inside of the windows, despite the tropical weather outside. "Temperatures still dropping," Tom reported, his voice strained. "And these readings, it's like the water around the ship is getting denser, heavier." Sarah kept trying different radio frequencies, desperate to re-establish clear contact with the divers. Through the static, they caught more fragments. "Can't move. Water's like glue, they're coming." The emergency lights began to strobe, casting strange shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. Equipment started failing across the ship. Navigation systems, depth finders, even the backup generators were struggling. Dr. Grant's voice cut through the growing chaos. "Blake wrote about this too. He said when the seals are broken, reality itself begins to thin. The boundaries between our world and somewhere else start to break down. A loud bang echoed through the ship, making everyone jump. Something was affecting the Endurance's hull, creating sounds that metal shouldn't make. The whole vessel groaned, like a living thing in pain. Through the windows, the sea had turned an impossible color, darker than black. Shapes moved in that darkness, things that couldn't exist in any natural ocean. The water around the ship began to swirl, not from any current, but as if something massive was moving beneath the surface. "Got them," Sarah suddenly shouted. The radio cleared for a moment, and Marcus's voice came through in a rush of words. "The statues are moving." "They're not. They were never statues at all. The scrolls, the writing, it's alive. Everything down here is alive." Leah's voice joined his, high with terror. "They're following us up. Don't let them reach the surface. You have to." The transmission cut off in a burst of static that made everyone's ears hurt. In its place came that singing again, louder now, almost forming words that human minds couldn't quite grasp. "The water pressure's changing," Tom reported, staring at his readings in disbelief. "It's like something's pushing up from below. Something big." Dr. Grant was frantically flipping through Blake's journal. "Here. Listen. They were never meant to be found. The temples I took them from were built to be tombs, not treasures. The priests warned me, but I wouldn't listen. Now I understand. These things were sealed away by people who knew what they really were. What they could do if they ever got free." The ship's radio system suddenly crackled to life on its own, all channels broadcasting simultaneously. Through the speakers came sounds that shouldn't have been possible underwater. Footsteps, whispers, and something else. Something that sounded like laughter but wasn't. Sarah's screen lit up with new sonar readings. There's something coming up from the wreck. Multiple somethings. They're not showing up right on the sensors, but they're there. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees. Frost crept across the control room windows, forming patterns that looked disturbingly like the symbols from the Marigold's hull. Everyone could feel it now, a presence or multiple presences, rising from the depths. "What are they?" Captain Ross demanded, his voice hoarse. "What did we actually find down there?" Dr. Grant's hands trembled as she read the last entry from Blake's journal. "They're not artifacts. They're not cursed objects or haunted relics. There's something older than humanity, something that was imprisoned in the deep long before our civilizations existed. And they've been waiting all this time, waiting for someone foolish enough to break those seals." The ship's hull groaned again, metal screaming under impossible pressure. Through the windows, they could see the water turning darker still, patterns of crimson light swirling in the depths like malevolent stars. Marcus's voice broke through one final time. "They're right behind us. Don't let them reach the ship. Don't let them get out. They're not what we thought they were. They're..." His words cut off in a burst of static that formed patterns, almost like laughter. In the control room, shadows deepened in the corners, taking shapes that shouldn't have been possible. And from below, that singing grew louder, closer, its words almost clear enough to understand. The truth about the Marigold's cargo was finally revealing itself, and it was far worse than anyone could have imagined. What they'd found wasn't just a shipwreck or a lost treasure. They'd broken seals that had kept something ancient and terrible imprisoned for centuries. And now it was awake. The next few minutes passed in a blur of chaos and mounting terror. The Endurance's systems were failing one by one, each shutdown accompanied by impossible sounds, metal twisting, voices whispering, and that endless, maddening song from the depths. "There," Tom shouted, pointing at his monitor. 2 small dots appeared on the radar, rising fast. "Marcus and Leah, they're almost here." Sarah grabbed her radio. "Surface team, get ready. They're coming up at bearing 040. The rescue crew rushed to the starboard side, fighting against winds that shouldn't have existed in the previously calm weather. The sea had turned completely black now, with swirls of that terrible crimson light pulsing beneath the surface like heartbeats. Marcus broke the surface first, practically exploding from the water. 2 rescue swimmers grabbed him, hauling him aboard. He was shaking violently, his face ghost white behind his diving mask. Leah emerged seconds later, her emergency tanks completely depleted. "Close it," Marcus screamed as soon as his mask was off. "The cargo hold. We have to seal it somehow." But even as he spoke, they all knew it was too late. The water around the ship began to churn, not from any natural current, but from something moving beneath. Multiple somethings. The crimson lights grew brighter, rising toward the surface like malevolent stars. Dr. Grant ran to the diving platform, Blake's journal clutched to her chest. "The mask," she shouted. "Did you see a black mask down there?" Leah ripped off her diving gear, her hands shaking so badly she could barely manage the clasps. It was in the big crate, the one with all the seals. We didn't know what would happen when we opened it." The ship's engines roared to life suddenly, without anyone at the controls. Captain Ross rushed to the bridge, fighting with the wheel as the Endurance began to move on its own, turning in a slow circle as if caught in a whirlpool that didn't exist. "It's trying to keep us here," Dr. Grant said, her voice barely audible over the growing chaos. "The mask, it's what controls them. Blake wrote about it. It's what they used to bind these things in the first place, but now..." A sound like thunder rolled up from the depths, but it wasn't thunder at all. It was laughter, deep, inhuman laughter that made everyone's ears bleed and their minds recoil. The crimson lights had reached the surface, spreading out in a perfect circle around the ship. Marcus grabbed Dr. Grant's arm. "The statues," he gasped. "They weren't statues at all. When we opened the crate, they started to move.
To change.
Like they were waking up from a long sleep." "Not sleeping," Leah cut in, her voice shaking. "Trapped. They were trapped down there, and we let them out." The ship's radio system crackled to life again, but this time what came through wasn't static. It was voices. Hundreds of voices, speaking in languages that hadn't been heard on Earth for millennia. And underneath them all was that singing, growing louder, its words becoming clearer with each passing second. Dr. Grant's hands trembled as she read from Blake's final entry. "The mask is the key. It's what the ancient priests used to control them, to bind them. But it's alive too, in its own way. It wants to be found. It wants to wake them up." The crimson lights breached the surface, revealing their true nature. They weren't lights at all, but eyes. Hundreds of eyes, belonging to shapes that rose from the water like living shadows. The statues had followed Marcus and Leah up from the depths, but they weren't stone anymore. They were changing, growing, taking forms that human minds couldn't properly process. Captain Ross ordered an emergency evacuation, but the ship wouldn't respond to any controls. The entire vessel was surrounded now, caught in a circle of those rising shapes. The water between them had turned thick and dark, like oil or blood. The scrolls, Marcus remembered suddenly. The writing on them, it wasn't just text. It was moving, like it was alive. "It was alive," Dr. Grant confirmed, her face pale. "Blake wrote about it. The scrolls contain their names, their true names, written in a language that can't exist in our reality. Reading them was part of what kept them bound." A sound like shattering glass filled the air, but it wasn't glass breaking, it was reality itself, cracking around the edges. Through those cracks came glimpses of something else, something beyond the world they knew. Spaces that couldn't exist, filled with angles that hurt to look at. The shapes rising from the water were fully visible now, though looking at them directly caused searing headaches and nosebleeds. They were vaguely humanoid, but wrong in ways that defied description. Their bodies seemed to shift and change, never settling on a single form. And in the center of it all, rising last from the depths, came the mask. It was floating on its own, water streaming from its surface like tears. Its empty eye sockets blazed with that same crimson light, but deeper, more ancient. Looking into them was like staring into an abyss that stared back. "They're not just monsters," Dr. Grant whispered, reading Blake's final words. "They're what our ancestors called gods. The kind of gods that had to be trapped and buried because they saw humans as nothing but toys to break." The mask rose higher, hovering above the churning water. The entities around the ship turned toward it, their ever-changing forms rippling with what might have been recognition. The singing reached a crescendo, and now everyone could understand the words. though understanding them made their minds scream in protest. They were words of awakening, of release. Words that had been written on those scrolls, carved into the Marigold's hull, sealed away for centuries until foolish humans had broken those seals. Marcus and Leah clung to each other, watching in horror as the mask's crimson gaze swept across the ship. Wherever its light touched, reality seemed to thin, showing glimpses of what lay beyond, spaces and entities that should never have been seen by human eyes. "What have we done?" Leah whispered, but her words were lost in the rising chorus of inhuman voices. The mask turned its empty eyes to the sky, and the very air seemed to tear open above it. Through that tear came something else, something worse, a darkness deeper than the space between stars, filled with movement and malevolent intelligence. The thing they had unwittingly unleashed wasn't just escaping its prison. It was opening a door, calling to others of its kind. The Marigold hadn't been just a shipwreck or a tomb. It had been a prison designed to keep these things trapped in the depths. And now they were free. Time seemed to break down around the Endurance. Moments stretched into eternities, then snapped back like rubber bands. The crew found themselves experiencing the same seconds over and over, watching helplessly as the ancient entities rose from the depths in an endless loop. The emergency protocols, Captain Ross shouted over the chaos. "We need to send out a warning." But the ship's communications were dead, replaced by that otherworldly singing. The radio only picked up voices speaking in languages that made the listeners' teeth ache. Even satellite phones showed nothing but static and strange symbols flowing across their screens. Marcus and Leah remained frozen on the deck, their diving suits still dripping water that seemed to move in wrong directions, defying gravity. They watched as more shapes emerged from the darkness below, each more impossible than the last. "The mask," Marcus said suddenly, his voice hoarse. "When we were down there, before everything went wrong, I saw something in that crate with it. Papers, documents." Dr. Grant spun toward him. "What kind of documents?" They looked newer than the scrolls, like someone had added them later. There were diagrams, instructions maybe? A horrible understanding dawned on Dr. Grant's face. She flipped frantically through Blake's journal. "Here, listen. If the worst should happen, if the seals are broken, there's still one way to bind them again. The mask isn't just their keeper, it's their prison. But the price of using it." The rest of the page was torn away, but a small notebook fell from between the journal's pages. Inside were drawings, diagrams, and notes written in Blake's increasingly frantic handwriting. "He figured it out," Dr. Grant breathed. "He knew he'd made a terrible mistake bringing these things aboard, so he found a way to trap them again. That's why the Marigold sank, not in a storm or by accident. Blake sank it deliberately, using the mask to seal them away in the depths." The entities circling the ship seemed to react to her words. Their ever-shifting forms rippled with what might have been anger. The mask, still hovering above the water, turned its crimson gaze toward the group on deck. "We have to do it again," Leah said, her voice stronger now. "We have to seal them away like Blake did." Tom, who had been monitoring what remained of the ship's instruments, spoke up. "Even if we could, the Marigold is compromised. The containment symbols are broken. We'd need somewhere else to trap them." "The Endurance," Captain Ross said quietly. Everyone turned to look at him. "We could use our own ship." The implications of his words sank in slowly. They would have to sink the Endurance, trapping the ancient entities in a new prison. But first, they would have to get the mask, the key to it all, back from the impossible creatures that now possessed it. Dr. Grant studied Blake's diagrams with shaking hands. "The symbols. We'd need to recreate them perfectly. Any mistake in the pattern would leave gaps they could escape through." "I can do it," Sarah said, surprising everyone. "I've been studying them since we found the wreck. I've got most of them memorized." The entities seemed to sense their planning. The crimson light grew brighter, and the shapes in the water began moving faster, their forms becoming more solid, more threatening. The mask's empty eyes blazed like dying stars. "We'll need time," Captain Ross said, his tactical mind already working on the problem. "Time to mark the ship, to get everything ready." "How do we get the mask?" Leah asked the question they were all thinking. We can't even look at these things without our minds starting to break. Marcus stood up slowly, his diving gear still half on. We go back down. Everyone stared at him. He continued, his voice growing stronger. They're stronger up here in our world. But down there, in the dark, in the pressure, that's where they were weak enough to be trapped the first time. Dr. Grant nodded slowly. Blake's notes suggest the same thing. The depth, the pressure, it constrains them somehow, makes them more vulnerable. A plan began to form, born of desperation and terrible necessity. They would have to split up, some staying aboard to prepare the ship, others diving back into the nightmare below to retrieve the mask. The entity's singing grew louder, more insistent. Reality continued to crack around the edges of their circle, showing glimpses of spaces that couldn't exist. The crew worked frantically, gathering supplies and preparing for what they knew would be their only chance. Marcus and Leah checked their backup tanks while Tom and Sarah gathered every piece of working recording equipment they could find. They would need proof of what happened here, something to warn others if they failed. The price, Dr. Grant said suddenly, reading from Blake's notes. Using the mask to bind them, it requires a sacrifice. Someone has to stay with them, become part of the seal. The implications hung heavy in the air. Someone would have to go down with the ship, wearing the mask, becoming part of the prison that would hold these ancient horrors. Captain Ross straightened his uniform. I'll do it. This is my ship, my responsibility. But before anyone could argue, the entities made their move. The circle of impossible shapes began to contract, squeezing the Endurance in a grip that made the hull groan. The mask's crimson gaze swept across the deck, and everywhere its light touched, reality began to tear. They were out of time. The ancient things were done playing with their food. Now, they would show the crew of the Endurance exactly what it meant to fall into the hands of the old gods. The final phase of their desperate plan would have to begin now, ready or not. As Marcus and Leah prepared to dive back into the nightmare below, they knew the fate of more than just their crew hung in the balance. What they had unleashed could destroy not just them, but the very fabric of reality itself. Their only hope lay in following Edmund Blake's last, desperate gambit, turning their own ship into a prison and paying whatever price was necessary to seal these horrors away once more. 3 weeks after the incident, Leah sat in a sterile government office, staring at her hands. The bandages were off now, but she could still see the marks where the mask's power had burned her skin. Across the table, a man in a black suit asked questions she couldn't fully answer. And you maintain that Captain Ross's actions were voluntary? His pen hovered over a thick folder of papers. For the 100th time, yes. Her voice was hoarse, damaged from the pressure changes during their final ascent. He chose to wear the mask. He knew what it meant. The official nodded, making another note. They'd been questioning her for days now, trying to understand what had happened to the Endurance. The ship's disappearance had caused too much noise to cover up completely, especially after pieces of the wreckage kept washing up on shores across the Atlantic, each piece marked with symbols that drove local researchers mad, trying to decipher them. Marcus sat in a similar room down the hall, telling his part of the story. They'd been separated since their rescue, but Leah sometimes felt she could still hear his thoughts, an echo of the connection they'd shared during those final moments underwater. The dive back down had been worse than anything they could have imagined. The entities had been waiting for them, turning the water into a maze of shifting shadows and impossible geometries. But they'd made it to the mask, managing to grab it during a moment when its crimson gaze was turned elsewhere. The ascent had been pure chaos. Reality itself had tried to tear them apart, the pressure of other dimensions pressing in from all sides. They'd barely reached the surface alive, clutching the mask between them like a burning coal. And the artifacts recovered from the debris? The official's voice pulled her back to the present. Destroyed, Leah lied, knowing the truth was in her sealed backpack back at the safe house. Blake's journal and notes, they couldn't risk those falling into the wrong hands. Everything went down with the ship. She remembered those final moments on the Endurance's deck. Sarah and Tom frantically carving symbols into the hull while Dr. Grant read the binding words from Blake's notes. The entities had raged around them, their forms becoming more solid as they sensed what was about to happen. Then Captain Ross had stepped forward, taken the mask, and put it on. The scream that followed wasn't human. It had come from everywhere and nowhere, a sound that made blood run from their ears and eyes. The captain's body had gone rigid, his back arching as the mask fused with his flesh. The symbols on the ship had begun to glow with that same crimson light. "Just one more thing," the official said, pulling out a photograph. "Can you explain these readings? Our instruments picked up some unusual patterns right before we lost contact with the Endurance." Leah glanced at the graph and felt her stomach lurch. The pattern of spikes and valleys was familiar. It matched the rhythm of that otherworldly singing she still heard in her nightmares. "No," she said firmly. "I can't explain your readings. I can't explain any of it." Later, outside the building, she found Marcus waiting. He looked older now, gray streaking his temples where there had been none before. Neither of them spoke as they walked to the nearby park, finding a bench far from any listeners. "They're still asking about the mask," he said finally. "They won't find it." Leah's hand unconsciously touched her chest, where the medallion hung beneath her shirt. Dr. Grant had given it to them before disappearing, a small bronze disc marked with symbols of protection. They won't find any of it. They both knew the truth. The Endurance lay in the deepest part of the Atlantic now, its hull marked with symbols of binding and containment. Captain Ross's sacrifice had worked. The entities were trapped once again, sealed away in a new prison of steel and mathematics. But the price had been high. Not everyone had made it off the ship in time. Dr. Grant had stayed behind with the captain, continuing to read the binding words even as the water rose around her. Tom had been lost during the evacuation, dragged under by something with too many limbs and eyes that shone like dying stars. "Sarah called," Marcus said quietly. "The nightmares are getting worse. She says she can hear them singing." Leah nodded. She heard it too every night. The entities might be trapped, but their influence lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed their awakening. Sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, she swore she could see crimson light bleeding through the walls of her room. "We need to destroy the journal," she said. "All of it. The notes, the diagrams, everything. And when they find the Endurance, when someone else gets curious about those symbols." Leah watched a family playing in the park, their laughter carrying on the wind. They had no idea how close their world had come to ending, how thin the barrier was between reality and the things that waited in the spaces between dimensions. "Then we'll be ready," she said. "We know what to look for now. We know the signs." They sat in silence, each lost in their own memories of that terrible day. The government might try to classify it, explain it away, but they knew the truth. The old gods weren't gone. They were just sleeping again, dreaming their dark dreams in their underwater prison. And somewhere in the depths, behind a mask fused to what had once been Captain Ross, they waited. Patient, eternal, knowing that someday someone else would me looking for them, drawn by the same curiosity that had doomed the crew of the Marigold centuries ago. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the park, Leah and Marcus headed their separate ways. But they both knew they'd never truly leave that day behind. They were bound now, marked by what they'd witnessed. Guardians by default, carrying a secret that could never be fully told. The Endurance's story would become another legend, another whispered tale of ships lost at sea. But for those who survived, it was more than a story. It was a warning, written in scars and nightmares, of things that waited in the deep. Things that wore masks of black stone and sang songs that could break reality. Things that were once again sleeping. For now.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.